I've seen the word misinformation misused or used as a bullying word like racism and so on, which are important concepts to identify, but they're nevertheless instead overused.
Yes.
Does that worry you? Because that seems to be the mechanism from inside Twitter, from inside Facebook, to label information you don't like versus information that's actually fundamentally harmful to society.
Yeah. So I think there is a meaning of disinformation that is very useful and helpful, which is when you have a concerted campaign by Russian agents to plant a story and spread it. And they've been doing that since the 50s or 40s even.
That's what this podcast actually is. But,
is what?
It's a disinformation
yeah,
campaign
you
by the
seem really
Russians.
Soviet to me, buddy.
It's subtle. It's between the lines. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
But so I think to the extent that there are campaigns by either foreign agents or just by the Republican or Democratic parties, there have been examples of that. But there are all kinds of concerted campaigns that are intending to confuse or spread lies. This is the fire hose of falsehood tactic. So it's very useful for that. All the companies need to have pretty large staffs, I think, to deal with that, because that will always be there. And that is really bad for our country. So Renee DiResta is just brilliant on this. Reading her work has really frightened me and opened my eyes about how easy it is to manipulate and spread misinformation, and especially polarization. The Russians have been trying since the 50s. They would come to America and they would do hate crimes. They would spray, swastikas in synagogues to make, and they spray anti-black slurs. They try to make Americans feel that they're as divided as possible. Most of the debate nowadays, however, is not that. It seems to be people are talking about what the other side is saying. So, if you're on the right, then you're very conscious of the times when, the left wouldn't let us even say, could COVID be from a lab? Like they would you literally would get shut down for saying that. And it turns out, we don't know if it's true, but there's at least a real likelihood that it is. And it certainly is something that should have been talked about. So I tend to stay away from any such discussions. And the reason is twofold. One is because they're almost entirely partisan. It generally is each side thinks what the other side is saying is fake, is misinformation or disinformation, and they can prove certain examples. So we're not going to get anywhere on that. We certainly are never going to get 60 votes in the Senate for anything about that. I don't think content moderation is nearly as important as people think. It has to be done, and it can be improved. Almost all the action is in the dynamics, the architecture, the virality. And then the nature of who is on the platform, unverified people, and how much amplification they get. That's what we should be looking at, rather than wasting so much of our breath on whether we're going to do a little more or a little less content moderation.
So the true harm to society, on average and over the long term, is in the dynamics. Is fundamentally in the dynamics of social media, not in the subtle choices of content moderation, aka censorship.
Exactly. There have always been conspiracy theories. The Turner Diaries is this book written in 1978. It introduced the replacement theory to a lot of people. Timothy Mcveigh had it on him when he was captured in 1995 after the Oklahoma City bombing. It's a kind of a Bible of that fringe, violent, racist, white supremacist group. And that, the killer in Buffalo was well acquainted with these ideas. They've been around, but this guy's from a small town. I forget where he's from. But he was, and he says in his manifesto, he was entirely influenced by things he found online. He was not influenced by anyone he met in person. Ideas spread and communities can form. These like micro communities can form with bizarre and twisted beliefs. And this is, again, back to the Atlantic article. I've got this amazing quote from Martin Gurri. Let me just find it. But Martin Gurri, he was a former CIA analyst, wrote this brilliant book called The Revolt of the Public. And he has this great quote. He talks about how in the age of mass media, we were all, in a sense, looking at a mirror looking back at us. And it might have been a distorted mirror, but we had stories in common. We had facts in common. It was mass media. And he describes how the flood of information with the internet is like a tsunami washing over us. It has all kinds of effects. And he says, this is in a comment in an interview in Vox, he says, the digital revolution has shattered that mirror, and now the public inhabits those broken pieces of glass. So the public isn't one thing. It's highly fragmented, and it's basically mutually hostile. It's mostly people yelling at each other and living in bubbles of one sort or another. And so, we now see clearly there's this little bubble of just bizarre, nastiness in which, the killer in Christchurch and the killer in Norway and now in Buffalo, they're all put into a community, and posts flow up within that community by a certain dynamic. So we can never stamp those words or ideas out. The question is not, can we stop them from existing? The question is, what are the platforms by which they spread all over the world and into every little town, so that the 1% of whatever percentage of young men are vulnerable to this, that they get exposed to it? It's in the dynamics and the architecture.
It's a fascinating point to think about, because we often debate and think about the content moderation, the censorship, the ideas of free speech. But you're saying, yes, that's important to talk about, but much more important is fixing the dynamics.
Yeah, that's right, because everyone thinks if there's regulation, it means censorship. At least people on the right think regulation equals censorship. And I'm trying to say, no, that's only if all we talk about is content moderation. Well, then yes, that is the framework. Mm-hmm. How much or how little do we, but I don't even want to talk about that, because all the action is in the dynamics. That's the point of my article. It's the architecture changed and our social world went insane.